Welcome to episode 10 of Reading to Mom. My name is Joe, the publisher at Historia Research near Printers Row in Chicago, Illinois. Well, in episode 10, or the reading of chapter 9, we thankfully reached the midpoint of this auditory ordeal. The author returns, finally, thankfully, to the story of Sidra as she acclimates to her new residence at the Acropolis on the edge of the Lyman. Once again, we are entertained, to say the least, by this author's attempts to voice act and bring to life the characters of his book. Thankfully, our guest reader has a number of lines in this chapter, and we hope that you enjoy her work. Hi, Mom. I know you're eager to return to Sidra's story, and hopefully chapter 9 does not disappoint. Unlike the first few chapters in which we meet Sidra as she's traveling to the Acropolis as a member of the Hecatomonanker, and then immediately sent to investigate the disappearance of a merchant in the Lyman, in chapter 9 we see her in a social setting interacting with commoners, nobles, and other fellow arcanists at this distant outpost. In her interactions with the denizens of the Acropolis, we learn she's somewhat distrustful of the leadership of the Acropolis, but also gain a little more insight into her character and her past as a member of the High Council. Sidra meets two more of the main characters in the work. The first, Aj, a dwarf fighter who she befriends while having a few drinks late into the evening. And then the Dynasties, who she goes to meet the next day, tardy and in a contentious mood due to the outcome at the Koboloi lair. The text differs somewhat from the reading you're about to hear because we have given additional lines to the voice of Sidra. We hope you enjoy these embellishments as she remains the primary source of the documentation for these events near the end of the Arcane Age. Chapter 9, Border Crossings. Her tour of the Acropolis with Kivon completed, Sidra rented a room at one of the local inns in hopes of securing her first solid night of rest after leaving Agrinio 3 months earlier. As she had not had a proper bath since she left Agrinio for the Acropolis, Sidra first headed to the adjoining bathhouse, where the inn strongly encouraged new guests to accept a complimentary wash tub. The communal bathhouses of the Provenance stand to this day as one of the crowning achievements of the Arcane Age. While hygienic practices first improved in the eastern cities following the Glorious Revolution, the recovered cities made the public bathhouses something like a form of entertainment for the many fortune seekers who ventured west.
The Biwans in particular, where the great populace spent most of their days in the field tending grains and produce, enthused that the evening wash served as a ritualistic sanctification for a day's labor, just as much as it served to cleanse the body of dirt absorbed into the pores and under the fingernails of the horticulturalists.
As Sidra observed. In Naxos, as part of her acculturation to the duties of the High Council, Sidra often visited the public bathhouses in order to conduct business on behalf of the master clerics or to exchange stories of new exploits with her fellow apprentices. In Libua, during her extended stay, she found herself indulging in the many luxury services offered during the late mornings to the arcanists who had no post or duty on the escort circuit. After a late night of debate and dissoluteness, Sidra enjoyed a long steam or submersion in the hot waters while rehashing with others the finer points of the prior evening, or logging with embarrassment what each recalled or did not recall from the late night's festivities. Believing she should keep a low profile until she had a chance to meet with the dynasties, she requested a private room where she could soak without distraction.
The voices of the patrons from the common pool easily carried through the curtains enclosing my tub, just loud enough to hold my attention, but muted so that I overheard only a little of the conversations.
3 times Sidra fell asleep in the tub's fragrant and warm waters. She startled each time, enveloped in dreams of the foreign world of the Acropolis, the mordant whispers and furtive glances of the townsfolk, seemingly stealing her breath. Her nostrils submerged beneath the surface of the water, she slipped into threatening unconsciousness again and again. After her third baptism and visions of marginal intrigues, Sidra rose from the bathwaters to dry herself and returned to her room for much-needed rest. She noted in her journal,
The simple comfort of bathing made me realize just how fatigued I was after the last leg of my journey to the ends of civilization.
Despite her exhaustion, however, she found that fresh memories from her first foray into the Lyman beat back her sleep. Eventually, her thoughts gave way to the din of a tavern outside her window. After tossing restlessly for an hour, the alluring sounds of merriment had stimulated her curiosity. Sidra rose from the knotty cot to dress. Certain that few denizens of the Acropolis knew of her arrival at the outpost, she chose common clothing that concealed her arcane abilities and stature as an apprentice to a member of the High Council. To avoid notice, she sneaked out the back door of the inn and made her way through an alley to the alluring tavern. The ploy worked for a time.
Affectionately known as the border crossing among locals, the pub enticed all manner of the commercial-minded people in the domain. Similar to the establishments in Libya, the revelers of the border crossing entertained themselves with tall tales about adventures and feats in the Lyman. The bartender, a comely gnome, darted to and fro between customers, skillfully climbing the stacked barrels to pour drafts, while our pet lizard basked motionless in the warm glow of the decorative lanterns ensconced in the center of the back bar. Occasionally the revelers traded rumors about conspiracy and bribery at the Acropolis, a subject much favored by the local inhabitants.
Sidra later recalled. She also noted one significant difference with the Libyan farmers who comforted themselves with the knowledge that their most dangerous days were behind them. The liberty of riches and the equality of avarice peppered the aspirations and asides shared by the Acropolitan patrons, who could not shake the thought that their next venture into the Lyman may be their last. The South's customers shared several interesting tidbits about the leadership of the Acropolis. To her surprise, Sidra discovered
The resident noble societies largely opposed the dynasty's most recent appointment, due to what they perceived as his favor for and gentle-handedness with the peoples of the Lyman.
per the constitution of the Provenance, the High Council nominated an Arcanist for the position of dynasties, a territorial governor to an unincorporated outpost who served a term of 7 years. And the People's Council approved the nominee by majority vote. 2 years prior to Sidra's arrival at the Acropolis, the dynasties had reluctantly accepted his 4th appointment to the position. Footnote 1. In contrast to the dynasty's tenure, many of the noble scholars, merchants, and commoners settled at the outpost more recently. Like most before them, the interlopers planned to leave a few years later, after securing a small fortune by any means possible. The local coin, while not directly engaged in commerce, supported distinctly biased laws and policies that serviced the merchant class of the Acropolis. In time, a frontier ethic took shape and seemed to attract the most venal citizens of the Provenance to the outpost. End footnote. 2 years prior to Sidra's arrival at the Acropolis, the dynasties had reluctantly accepted his 4th appointment to the position. The discovery of a cache of artifacts in the West Lyman that dated to the early epochs of the age, by none other than the missing merchant who also became the new owner of the public house of the people, spurred a new wave of immigration in the years before the arrival of the Naxian cleric. Merchants from other cities came to the settlement to aggressively organize raiding parties of mercenaries and arcanists in searches for more loads of arcane artifacts for resale in the marketplaces of the Provenance. Footnote 2. Sidra later learned that several cultures that traced their origins to the preternatural city of Tityos created the artifacts in the epochs following the Glorious Revolution. Historically unrelated and unrecorded by the annalists of the Provenance, several vibrant and inventive societies apparently formed in the West Lyman during the years immediately following the defeat of the sorcerer of Tityos. Little was known to the peoples of the Provenance about the history of the territory surrounding the Acropolis, and even less is known to the modern antiquarian today. Mysteriously, the former Titians made great and rapid advances in the crafting of artifacts, and then disappeared from history in some conflagration that obliterated their society and the records of their dominion. End footnote. Merchants from other cities came to the settlement to aggressively organize raiding parties of mercenaries and arcanists in searches for more loads of arcane artifacts for resale in the marketplaces of the Provenance.
Crazed by the desire for immediate wealth and single-minded with the purpose to return with the plunder of the Lyman, the merchant militias seemed to commit atrocities against nearby cultures with such a regularity that, while listening to the tales of a drunken sot, I was reminded of my elders who told stories of the mercenaries of the Godheads to young and unruly children.
In the prior month, after another bloody clash between merchants and the Lyman peoples, the dynasties agreed to demands from the orcs in the region to restrict merchant militias to 11 members or fewer. Not long after, a noble juicer confided in Sidra as she sipped on a spirit distilled by one of the despised peoples beyond the commercial control of the Provenance, the kobold knaves way to seize the wealthiest merchant of our Acropolis.
I nearly disclosed my knowledge of the situation to correct the fellow of his misconceptions, but I caught myself before I revealed my identity.
After parting with the noble, Sidra befriended a commoner who forgot his coin purse at home. When she ordered up a third round for the both of them, the commoner mentioned that he participated in the healing community, led by a peripatetic cleric who resettled in the territory within the past year. The commoner, Sidra noted, seemed to be deeply suspicious of the master cleric of the established guild of the Acropolis.
According to this commoner, the peoples of the Lyman were in turmoil, and conflicts with the Acropolis had escalated over the past several months. The master cleric who heads the guild of the Acropolis hired a band of mercenaries to investigate events transpiring in the communities beyond the jurisdiction of the Provenance. The mercenaries, however, stirred up more trouble, and, according to this fellow, led to the Koboldo's kidnapping of the celebrated merchant for some nefarious purpose. Believing the master cleric had gone rogue, so to speak, the commoner joined a healing community led by a traveling cleric, Themis, who had no affiliation with local authorities. Themis seemed to have earned a favorable reputation with the commoners, who distrust the Acropolitan leaders as well as those who work closely with them. Although unclear on the specifics, the commoner indicates that his new healing community does not waste time tending the neediness of others. We seek personal salvation from within. The sentiment sounds like the mystical tripe I frequently heard from the nobility in Libua.
Her conversation with the local came to an abrupt end when a stein of paling ale slammed down on the bar in front of her, splashing suds in her face. Doing a little reconnaissance, are you? Your attire almost deceived me, but I know you. You be Sidra, cleric and emissary of the High Council. Stammering, the commoner quickly downed the remnants of his last pint of ale, thanked Sidra for her kindness, and scampered out of the main room toward the latrines. He looked over his shoulder several times, as if frightened by the idea that she was following him.
When I turned to see who addressed me, I sized up a remarkable dwarf with a dark complexion, long dreadlocks of hair flowing down his chest and back, and a graying beard that hinted at his maturity.
He hung his dwarven war axe on the weapon rack that the barkeep had specially built into the support beams beneath the handcrafted rail decorating the top of the bar. The muscular, stocky fighter, who stood around 3 1/2 cubits tall, stepped into the bar's footstool to elevate himself into the seat to her right. With a grunt, The stranger hoisted himself into the adjacent bar stool. Sidra briefly considered telling the dwarf that he was mistaken, but before she had the chance to reestablish her subterfuge, the uninvited guest introduced himself. "My name Biage. We never met, but I've been an associate of a Paline council member. She brung me to view the High Council on the day you presented the findings of the Lacrache Emmons affair." Footnote 3. Sidra's record of her conversation with Odge is one piece of evidence that ties her name to the anonymous text on the incineration of the half-orc and the proceedings of the High Council. Her record of the conversation suggests the dialect of the dwarf conveyed by the quotes. See footnote 2, chapter 5. The charring of Lacrache Emmons. End footnote. Lacrache Emmons, the first half-orc barbarian to serve on the High Council, and the only member of the High Council to be killed in session. The Council possibly appointed Sidra to assess where the fault lay in the use of unnecessary force against one of its members. Sidra indicated it was the only time that she ever presented herself to the full body of the Council and scrawled in her journal.
What misfortune beckoned this dwarf to the border crossing on this evening?
Before she was able to determine her response to the indiscreet dwarf, Odge offered to share his memory of Sidra's presentation. "Not to be asking me, but I think you got it wrong. The High Council should have left that charred half-orc die as a lesson to those hot-headed Mixlan." Vexed by Odge's boisterous greeting, Sidra resigned herself to the revelation of her identity. She welcomed the Eastern Arcanist into her confidence and rebuked the prejudiced musings of the dwarf.
Well, yes, you are correct. I am Sidra, a former adjunct to the High Council. If I may say, your colleagues shared your sentiments for Lacrache, so I'm fully aware of the political views of the dwarves in that matter.
Well enough, friend. Though it makes me stomach ache to think of those half-beasts meddling in our political affairs. After pouring the remainder of his stein of ale down his maw, Odge leaned back into his stool to continue his indictment of orcs. Sidra wanted to avoid the dispute entirely, so she offered him a drink.
Let me refill your stein and skip the debate on the impolitic discord between half-orcs and dwarves.
"I accept," Odge graciously agreed. "'Tis good to see an Easterner who serves the interests of the Provenance in these parts. What mission of the Council's brings ya to the Acropolis, Sidra?" Sidra hedged, concealing her charge from the Council's. Instead, she indicated she worked for the dynasties to locate the merchant recently lost in the Lyman. "Well, stuffin'. The Koble don't have him. If I know the fool, he probably went to trade his gold for iron with the orcs. Those treacherous bastards won the negotiations, no doubt." Odge's comments surprised Sidra.
The rude dwarf was the first denizen of the Acropolis who absolved the kobolds of the merchant's disappearance. His reason may have been prejudice, but his opinion's true.
The two apparently sat for some time discussing reasons for his journey to the Acropolis. He came from Paline in search of his father, who disappeared in the Lyman several years ago. Odge's father believed an early Arcane Age culture of dwarves once dwelt in the mountainous regions of the West Lyman. "It was preposterous," Odge confided. "The fairest mountains forged the dwarven peoples." Sidra agreed. A forgotten dwarven community located in the Orphean Mountains seemed unfathomable. The earliest recorded history of the dwarves placed them in the Ferris Mountains in the region surrounding Paline during the early Arcane Age. No tale or myth suggested dwarves originated or colonized the Western Mountains during the history of the Provenance. She inquired,
Why would your father pursue such a foolhardy quest?
Odge shrugged his shoulders. "Asphates, our classical powers demands two virtues, bravery and wisdom. A readiness to endure dangers and the noha to vanquish peril. Me pappy was endowed with too much of the former and not enough of the latter." The conversation later turned to Sidra's deception of the tavern's patrons. Odge questioned her relentlessly. Why would an official attaché of the dynasties present herself as a commoner to the denizens of the Acropolis?
I provided no convincing answer to the obstinate dwarf. Eventually, one too many steins into the evening, I confessed that the High Council sent me to the Acropolis in response to the request of the local nobles. Upon my arrival, I told the Pauline dwarf, the half-orc gatemaster Oron seemed to send me to my death in the lair of the Koboloi. I had not yet met the dynasties. Discomfited by my first venture into the linemen and suspicious of the authorities who governed the outpost, I divulged that I felt uncertain who to trust on the threshold of this unimaginable borderland.
Odge laughed heartily at such a concession. He then related his own difficulty to learn the ongoings and fate of his parent during his brief time at the Acropolis. Few people admitted that they recalled a visit from the Pauline dwarf. Even when they did so, his departure from the Acropolis seemed to escape their memories. The local folk cling to their secrets more tightly than a dwarf clings to the last stein of stout at the Mistagua, he jested. Footnote 4. Mistagua, literally, initiation, in reference to the rite of passage to adulthood for dwarves. In contrast to the veritable explosion of discussion about the differences between the sexes during the early and middle Golden Age, the dwarves treated their young with equality and engendered no distinctions in ability between male and female children. Most Provenancial cultures practiced gender equity, but the dwarves excelled to a degree that many outsiders had difficulty telling the two genders apart. Adulthood and the maturation of reproductive organs, however, raised the specter of differences and inequality. In dwarven culture, Mistagua referred to an initiation into the mysteries of distinctions without differences, or equality in difference, for both young men and women. The rituals entailed the hearty consumption of dark ales late into the night, and extant records suggest forged many couplings resulting in lifelong partnerships among the dwarves. See Couchelet, History of Arcane Sexuality, Chapter 5 in Passum. End footnote. The local folk cling to their secrets more tightly than a dwarf clings to the last stein of stout at the Mistagua, he jested.
Together, we two Eastern Arcanists polished off an urn of Pauline ale while discussing an assorted variety of subjects far into the night.
Despite the short time she had spent with him, she came to respect the dwarf as a comrade. Before they stumbled out of the border crossing, she arranged to contact him before her next journey into the linemen. The next morning, Sidra awoke to the sounds of heavy knocks on the door to her room at the inn. At first, discovering she had a severe headache, she ignored her tormentor in hopes the disruption would simply go away. After the fourth series of demanding thuds, she surrendered and rose to open the door. A messenger from the dynasties greeted her and informed her that the governor expected to see her in his quarters within the hour. The death of the leaders of the Koboloi at the hands of the group under her command, as well as her failure to recover the missing merchant, displeased the dynasties. Be prepared to defend your action, the messenger warned her with an unpleasant smirk. After curing her hangover with a minor healing spell, Sidra dressed in her finest arcane gear and headed toward the military district of the Acropolis. At first, she set out in the direction of the military headquarters, but then decided to follow a roundabout path to the dynasties.
The governor showed no consideration to me upon my arrival. Why should I have dishonored myself in a prompt heed to his beckoning?
She later noted in her journal. Although the military division directly bordered the Commoner's Inn, she circled through the fortress to survey the early morning activity of the guilds, mechanic shops, and merchant marts. She discovered a hurried, if groggy, populace in the streets of the Acropolis. The two most active areas were the Guild of the Clerics and the lean-to erected by the apprentices of the traveling cleric. She observed,
The clientele from the outpost taverns queued in long lines outside the entrances to the healers' tents, who, like me, awoke in need of respite from the joys of libation.
recalling a quip of the Libuan farmers. Most commoners who exited from the clerical shelters, cured of their excesses, headed toward the gates of the keep, where the local military waited to escort them to the mines. The bureaucratic nobles headed toward the city center to tend to the affairs of the people. The Arcanists, who also shared in the evening celebrations, scattered in every direction to engage the mechanics for repairs or to sift through the newest wares of the merchants.
If I were inclined to secure a competency, the Acropolis certainly can afford a cleric's simple talents.
Sidra wrote. Passing through the mechanics division, she crossed paths with Matna, who headed to the smithy to have his styrax sharpened. To Sidra's surprise, she saw his blade reflecting in the morning light as if it were a silver-plated mirror. Wondering why he tended to his weapon so fastidiously, her prejudice got the better of her as she remembered a comment once told to her by a mechanic artist in Paline.
We welcome barbarians to our city, who waste their wealth to whet razor-sharp axes.
Though Sidra's morning star was not in disrepair, the long journey from the east and the handful of conflicts she survived had blunted the spikes of the iron ball secured to the shaft. Nonetheless, she never thought to visit a local smithy to repair her weapon so soon. As they made their way through the stands of the craftsmen, she saw the varying quality of the artifacts, and her thoughts returned to the unusual care that Matna showed for his weapon. She thought to herself,
Perhaps I failed to understand them, Ixalan. Eventually, I succumbed to my self-doubt and unsheathed my weapon for Matna to inspect. Is it your opinion that the arm be serviced already?
Without glancing at her morning star, the Nelez nodded his head and dropped a pearl of barbarian wisdom on her. The riches of good fortune are ever uncertain. They are narrowly lost or narrowly won.
I failed to grasp the barbarian's meaning in the moment, but all the same, I handed him the weapon and a few coins to have done what he willed.
Proceeding through the mercantile marts, Sidra spotted Eosh haggling with a merchant over the price of the wares she stole from the koboloi. She paused for a minute, thinking to greet the rogue and to re-establish their acquaintances with a fresh start, but then moved along after Eosh glowered at her. Footnote 5. The rogue later confided that cleric's garb was often far too ornate to barter successfully with the region's merchants. As Sidra noted in passing as she moved through the marketplace of the Acropolis, clerics earned a fine competency on the borderlands. Peddlers of arcane and mechanical wares knew well that the minor healing spell of the cleric fetched a premium in the territory. To claim their just rewards, the other merchants often charged clerics additional fees or lowballed the value of saleable goods.
A death tax on sales of immortality.
As the vindictive merchants joked among themselves. End footnote. Proceeding through the mercantile marts, Sidra spotted Eosh haggling with a merchant over the price of the wares she stole from the koboloi. She paused for a minute, thinking to greet the rogue and to re-establish their acquaintance with a fresh start, but then moved along after Eosh glowered at her. After leaving the vibrant bazaar, the cleric stepped up her pace in order to reach the dynasties before the midday hour. Although the mercantile quintile stood adjacent to the mercenaries' accommodations, Sidra failed to account for the time each sergeant-at-arms felt compelled to waste before permitting her to pass through the defenses of the dynasty's headquarters. The gatekeeper stationed at the gates to the military sector, secured behind a 17-foot-high wall that separated the hex from the rest of the outpost, at first rebuffed Sidra's assertion that she had business with the dynasties. Formal regulations required all non-military visitors to present documentation of a summoning to the sergeant before she may grant entry to the military quarters.
Apparently, the notary sent for me had neglected to provide the proper notice of summons to fulfill the order.
Sidra wryly noted. At Sidra's request, the military bureaucrat sent a soldier at arms to verify her appointment with the secretary of the headquarters.
After what seemed like enough time to review the roll of visitors for the last Triska decade.
The soldier returned with word of Sidra's appointment. Relieved she had gained access without further trial, she sprinted past the gatekeeper before he was able to assent to the minor breach of protocol. Signage directed her to the austere yet imposing building in one of the 5 corners of the Acropolis.
As I approached the reinforced doors of the military headquarters, the spires of your enemies seemed to rise above the edifice like vengeful spearheads that would cause invaders to cower in fear.
Her trepidation at the sight of the Acropolis melting into the dark crown of your enemy quickly subsided, however, when the sergeant-at-arms stationed directly outside the headquarters refused to allow her to enter the massive doors without the proper notice of summons. Frustrated by yet another obstinate officer who controlled access to the castle, she sauntered back to the gates of the military quintile's entrance to collect her pass. Hours late for the summons, Sidra's first consultation with the dynasties went poorly. Footnote 6. Sidra's account of her meeting with the dynasties has not survived the depredations of time. The following account of their exchange comes largely from the collected records of the dynasties. The official records do not reflect favorably on Sidra, especially in light of subsequent events. In his own records, the dynasties substantiates the characterizations of the Acropolitan nobles who regarded the governor as too sensitive to the plight of the linemen. Unfortunately, the dynasties did not keep records as meticulously as his council counterpart. Without Sidra's notes about the meeting, it's then difficult to know entirely what transpired between the two headstrong philosophers, and who was largely to blame for the grave misunderstandings. No doubt, however, the first meeting alienated the two arcanists charged by the councils of the Provenance to resolve the disturbances along the linemen. End footnote. Hours late for the summons, Sidra's first consultation with the dynasties went poorly. The dynasties occupied something like a middle ground between an officer of the Provenance and magistrate of the Acropolis, between an executive of governance and a minister of law. The high councils routinely appointed fellow philosophers to the posts of dynasties in each city of the Provenance. The People's Council voted their approval or disapproval of the selection, but the popular vote was non-binding for the High Council. The appointees typically served 7-year terms and rarely lost the post unless forced into exile under the duress of scandal. The dynasties of the Acropolis, 2 years into an unprecedented fourth term, won near unanimous approval from both chambers for his first 2 terms. His third appointment witnessed the first signs of resentment among the locals for his management of the border outpost. The council members of Agrinio, favorable to their traders at the Acropolis, abstained from the vote to register opposition to the governor's sentiment to maintain peace with the linemen at all costs. During his third term, opposition swelled, resulting in over 1/3 of the People's Councils voting against his fourth term, an opposition purchased by the greed of merchants, the dynasties dryly noted in his records. Footnote 7. In other documents from his papers, the dynasties indicated his reluctance to serve the Provenance in the same role for another 7 years. The character of the opposition, however, seemed to have changed his resolve. Convinced his opponents threatened to undermine the peace he marshaled with the cultures of the linemen, the normally dispassionate commander determined, "I must weather the maelstrom of materialism that engrosses the new wave of adventurers coming to the linemen." From Letter to the High Council, number 857, from the Acropolis, around the 11th epoch, 7th period of the Arcane Age, in the collected records of the dynasties. End footnote. At the Acropolis, when the Dicastrion, a judicial tribunal formed by 3 or more members of the People's Council, was not in session, the dynasties served as the final arbiter of legal administration and justice. To quote Sidra's assessment,
The dynasties at this edge of our democracy ruled like a benevolent despot, checked only by the limits of his term and the episodic overruling by the commoners' tribunals.
at the edge of provenantial civilization, the Dicastrion met irregularly, often only 2 or 3 times per year, and for no more than 7 weeks at a sitting. As a consequence, the denizens of the Acropolis actively pursued the favor of the dynasties, even while whispering recriminations in the ears of newcomers to the taverns at the outposts. Paladins, many who preferred the imprimatur of law to endorse their actions, frequently assumed the posts in the Provenance. Although no legal doctrine required the appointee to be a paladin, nor an emigre to the city served, the High Council traditionally selected members of the judicious class for the position of dynasties. The arrangement proved to be a mutually rewarding relationship. The paladins demonstrated themselves to be remarkably flexible and circumspect in the execution of their duties. Dedicated in equal share to the law and to the social well-being of the citizenry, their intuition for justice possessed an esoteric ability to recognize when law failed to anticipate new political and economic conditions. In times of crisis, the discretion of the territorial governors shepherded the conflicting interests in the life and policies of the province. The dynasties of the Acropolis, who was no exception, epitomized the ethic of the paladin. He ended every one of his binding decisions with the pithy refrain in Paladinic meter. Footnote 8. Paladinic meter. 7 lines of 7 syllables each. End footnote. The dynasties of the Acropolis, who was no exception, epitomized the ethic of the paladin. He ended every one of his binding decisions with the pithy refrain in Paladinic meter to defend the honor of his judgment. A verse. Whereas the work of arcane philosophy heretofore has been interpretation of the world in certain ways, the purpose of the powers, classical, shall always be to smite the world's injustice. End verse. Arriving over 3 hours after the dynasties made known his intent to hear a report on her mission to the lair of the Kobolai, Sidra showed little regard for the implicit authority exercised by the governor of a remote territory. While his papers do not offer the copious detail one finds in Sidra's journal, the dynasty's record of their first meeting casts a shadow on the image Sidra draws for herself in her own journals. At one point, the dynasties noted, the council's attendant dared to question my order to send her to the lineman before she had a night of solid rest, insinuating our reconnaissance of the Kobolai's strength proved unacceptably faulty. The dynasties tolerated no aspersions against the execution of his responsibilities and reminded Sidra he had maintained peaceful relations with the cultures of the linemen for over a generation. The dynasties then scolded her for the death of the Kobolai leaders. Again, she insisted the blame in her failure to deliver the missive of the Acropolis fell upon others. The purpose of her mission to the Kobolai stemmed from the erroneous idea that the Kobolai had snatched the traitor. Footnote 9. Although the words for traitor and traitor are not homonyms in the arcane tongue, as they are in our modern language, the dynasty's records use the term traitor in his account of the exchange with Sidra. It appears to be an unusual error in the records, but it may be Sidra described the traitor as a traitor, as a reflection of her judgment for the merchant who occupied the public house of the Acropolis. Alternatively, the dynasties may have used the term deliberately, letting slip his own opinion of the merchant. End footnote. Again, she insisted the blame in her failure to deliver the missive of the Acropolis fell upon others. The purpose of her mission to the Kobolai stemmed from the erroneous idea that the Kobolai had snatched the traitor. As she had written in her journal,
Why did the dynasties believe the Kobolai kidnapped the merchant? Why were there no instructions taking into consideration the Kobolai had nothing to do with the merchant's disappearance?
Sidra's final critique of the dynasty's leadership, for her Sum, questioned how it was the authorities of the Acropolis knew nothing about an alliance between the Kobolai and Orc tribes. All else aside, the communique for the Kobolai ended in conflict due to the inexplicable actions of an Orc, who by all accounts had no reason to be present at the diplomatic exchange. The dynasties deflected the accusations, suggesting his duty did not encompass the consideration of every possible response of the Kobolai chieftains to the missive, or the provision of orders for each potential outcome. My duty is to make known to the peoples of the Lyman the interests of the Provenance, and to defend such interests when necessary. The council, in its wisdom, sent Sidra to support the peaceful relationships the Provenance maintained with the local cultures. Surely, the Dynasties chided her, the council chose someone held in high regard for her ability to uphold the guiding principles and interests of the Provenance when unanticipated circumstances called for personal discretion and judicious action. Lastly, the governor wondered why the cleric had not seen fit to ask the chieftains about the orc and object to the privilege afforded the orc in attendance at a meeting between Kobolai and Provenance. Her duty was to deliver the missive to the Kobolai chieftains, but that did not restrict her from engaging them in discussion about other uncommon occurrences or alliances among the peoples of the Lyman. If Sidra's companions had not been more inquisitive and discerning than her, I doubt we would have had this conversation, he opined. In his records, the Dynasties also suggest the rapacious cleric fed it on the feast of the Kobolai until dullness set upon her. In short, the governor believed the cleric performed poorly on her first mission to the Lyman. She focused on reading a letter sent on a pretext to determine whether a minor group of thieves in my territory knew anything of our missing merchant. One other aspect of Sidra's report on the actions of the lone orc in the Kobolai lair caught the attention of the Dynasties. He appears to have withheld his thoughts from Sidra, but carefully preserved them in the official records of the Acropolis. Clearly, he wrote, the orc knew that he could not withstand the force of the Mixellen I had sent to defend Sidra. Evidently referring to Matna. The rest of the passage is worth quoting in full as the type of insight the Dynasties culled from the mundane facts of life along the Lyman, a perspicuity that undoubtedly served him well during his tenure at the limits of the Provenance. His attack was a calculated suicide, and in itself an all too common occurrence among the barbarians of the region, often unworthy of note. What stands out plainly is the orc's design to deal a deadly blow to Sidra before her Sum could lend aid. Do the orcs know the High Council's meddlesome outsider? Moreover, who among them regards her death favorable to the well-being of the Lyman? The council seemed to be hiding its true purpose in sending this lowly page to the region. And surely it will be no coincidence when she soon meets with her unenviable demise. Footnote 10. The collected records of the Dynasties suggest that he may have sent 2 druids in winged form to Naxos to discover why the council selected a neophyte for such an important duty along the Lyman, but no further evidence exists of the request or the response. End footnote. In her personal papers, Sidra failed to grasp this remarkable aspect of her mission to the Kobolai leaders. Consumed as she was by the demands of leadership and the numerous challenges her companions presented her with, Sidra concluded the orc attacked her because he recognized the true leader of the band. Footnote 11. An inexplicable oversight on her part. Barbarians are most powerful at the beginning of a skirmish when they first unleash their passions. Technically, these arcanists learn to concentrate their initial attacks on the strongest foe. Clearly, as Sidra stammered during her reading of the letter to the Dynasties, to the Kobolai chieftains, the most powerful foe in the Sum was Matna. End footnote. Nevertheless, both agreed that the orc trespasser in the lair of the Kobolai offered one lead to the whereabouts of the missing merchant, but he felt that the outcome of Sidra's prior execution of her duties ended in such a way that her effectiveness as an emissary to the Lyman cultures had diminished after the assault on the den of lizard-like thieves. Perhaps to test her mettle, the Dynasties suggested Sidra remain at the Acropolis to rest after her long journey from the city of Naxos. My messengers had to decamp soon to set out for the Lyman and see if the Orc clan will parley with the representatives of the Provenance, the Dynasties wrote in his account of the dispute. I hesitate to grant the indelicate if tenacious cleric another opportunity to destroy the goodwill I spent a lifetime to negotiate. To sway the judgment of her officer,
I carefully chose my words, complimenting the Dynasties for the unprecedented peace his vision made possible for over a generation. I intimated his command offered the best guarantee for 5 more years of peace to end his 4th term. Undoubtedly, I added, the fresh fractures in our relations with the Lyman are no result of your gentle hand. The wisdom of the council spoke when they named you, Dunastes, to a 4th term.
Her argument, deftly quoting the apparition of Kivon's haunting dream, pointed to a
the strange wind poisoning the minds of the Lyman. If the local cultures no longer heed the counsel of our most beneficent governor, a noxious cloud must impair their judgment. The Acropolitans need an outsider who has no history or entanglements with the commerce between the 2 worlds. In short, if you hesitate to place your trust in me, you risk misplacing your trust in a familiar arcanist whose allegiance may no longer be pledged to our side of the border.
Evidently, Sidra's remonstrations won the day. The Dunastes agreed not only to send her, but also named her the leader of the Arcanist Sum as an endorsement of the will of the High Council. Of the latter compromise, the Dunastes later wrote, I regret more than any other decision I made in my lifetime, along this unforgiving border where reason and passions meet. His hindsight, more powerless than prescient, failed to undo the decision. Soon after, the proud governor acceded to Sidra's charms. She further confounded the paladin with a request to form her own band of philosophers, to lead to the orc leaders, and to deliver the peaceful entreaties of the Acropolis. The Dunastes balked at the request and impugned his petty officer for an insinuation questioning the wisdom of his selection for companions.
I reminded the commander that both of us were appointees of the council who had a duty to find common ground and work together to find a resolution to the local disturbances along the border.
In addition, while deferring to the recommendation of the Dunastes, Sidra confessed she preferred the accompaniment of a wizard over a rogue. The Eastern native insisted her combat training emphasized how best to commingle the clerical abilities and wizardry, rather than roguery. She persisted.
If conflict be inevitable, I can summon the most powerful and least deadly force with the aid of a thaumaturgist.
The Dunastes ultimately agreed to every impertinence that Sidra had committed in order to secure the leadership of the orc expedition. Before parting, however, the Dunastes admonished Sidra for her short-sightedness. Without the wind of passions to tend empathy for your foes, you risk succumbing to the weight of reason on the scales of combat. This concludes Chapter 9 of Arcane Cage.